There is an animal that walked beside human beings before we built a single city, before farming, before writing, before we even had a word for ourselves as a species. For most of the last 100 years, scientists assumed they understood what it was. A tamed wolf, a useful tool, a guard at the edge of the fire. That was the story. It was the story every textbook printed. But when geneticists finally began to read the deep DNA hidden inside the bones of ancient dogs, what they found did not match the story. It matched something stranger, something older, and it had been buried under our feet for 15,000 years. You have to start with the ground itself, with the cold high plains of Central Asia, the river valleys of Siberia, the cave systems of the Altai Mountains, the frozen edges of the last ice age. Somewhere in that vast, brutal landscape, between roughly 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, something happened between two species that had never happened before in the history of life on this planet. A predator that had evolved to compete with humans for the same prey, the gray wolf, slowly, generation by generation, became something else. The bones tell us when, the teeth tell us how. But for almost a century, the question of where and why and what these earliest dogs actually did for the people who lived with them sat in a fog that no archaeologist could clear. The dogs had been there the whole time. We just could not read what they were saying. The accepted version of the story was simple and elegant. Dogs, the textbook said, were domesticated by hunter-gatherer humans somewhere in Eurasia, probably once, possibly twice, to serve as hunting partners and camp guards. They followed our scraps. We tolerated the tamest among them. Over thousands of years, a relationship formed. They were tools in the end, useful animals, pleasant company at the fire. Eventually, when humans invented farming and built cities, the dogs were repurposed for new jobs. Herding sheep, pulling sleds, guarding doors. That was the version every nature documentary repeated. It was a beautiful explanation. Logical, almost poetic. It was also incomplete. When geneticists began sequencing the DNA of ancient dog remains in the late 2000s and through the 2010s, they expected to confirm what was already in the textbooks. They expected a single point of origin. They expected a clean branching tree from one ancestral wolf population. They expected the genetic signal to closely track the spread of human agriculture. They expected, in short, a tidy story. What they found was none of those things. They found multiple deep lineages. They found ancient dog populations in places no one had predicted, doing things no one had imagined. They found genetic signatures that did not move with farmers, but with hunters, with herders, with travelers across ice. The data was asking a question that history had never thought to ask. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what makes the dog unusual, even before you look at any genome. Almost every other domesticated animal on Earth was tamed after humans invented agriculture, in the last 12,000 years, for a clearly economic reason. Cattle for meat and milk, sheep for wool, chickens for eggs. Goats, pigs, horses, camels, all of them late arrivals, all of them tied to settled life. The dog is the only large animal that humans domesticated as hunter-gatherers, thousands of years before we grew a single field of wheat. There was no economic system for it to fit into. There were no farms for it to protect. There were no fences. There were no markets. Whatever the dog was, in the beginning, it was something that nomadic humans needed badly enough to feed, to shelter, and to carry across continents on foot, through ice ages, before we had any of the systems we now use to explain why we keep animals at all. The first theory was the most obvious one. The earliest dogs were hunting assistants. They helped track wounded prey, they cornered large game, they warned the camp of predators in the night. That part is almost certainly true. It explains why dogs and humans co-evolved across so many environments. It explains the strong bond visible even in the oldest burials. It explains the consistent presence of dog remains alongside human remains in Paleolithic sites from Germany to the Russian steppe. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain why some of the earliest dog burials show animals that were old, injured, fed by hand, kept alive long past any hunting usefulness. It does not explain why ancient dogs in some regions were buried with the same ceremony as human beings, wrapped in fur, laid with grave goods, sprinkled with red ochre. It does not explain the geographic spread, which moved faster and farther than any hunting partnership alone could account for. The first theory explains a great deal. It does not explain what made this animal different from every other animal in human history. Which brings us to the second theory. To understand it, you have to go back to the late Pleistocene, into a chapter of human prehistory that is only now coming into focus. Between roughly 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets retreated and human populations began to move into new territories at unprecedented speed, dogs were not following behind. They were moving with the people, in step, often arriving in new lands at exactly the same moment. Researchers like Peter Savolainen, Gregor Larson, and Anders Bergstrom have spent years documenting how ancient dog lineages track specific human migrations. Into Europe, across the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, down through the Pacific into Polynesia. The dogs were not just hunting companions, they were transport partners. They were heat sources on freezing nights. They were sentinels in unknown country. They were, in some cultures, the difference between a migration that survived and a migration that did not. The second theory says that without dogs, the human expansion into the cold north, into the Arctic, into the Americas, may not have been possible at all. And it is powerful, and even it does not fully explain what the data is now showing.